When Nietzsche was 24 years old, he became a professor at Basel University in Switzerland, and there he attended the lectures of Jacob Burckhardt, a prominent classicist. The two became friends, although Burckhardt was far older and more respected than the young Nietzsche, and Burckhardt was more like a mentor to him. Nietzsche was lit afire by Burckhardt's lectures on the Greeks, and he wrote that they were full of, quote, profound thoughts and strangely abrupt breaks and twists as soon as they touched the danger point, end quote. The two of them would go on walks together on the grounds of the campus and discuss philology, and Nietzsche hung on to every word. And even though, relatively speaking, they only spent a short time of their lives together in person, they maintained a correspondence until the end of Nietzsche's productive life, and Nietzsche would send Burckhardt every book he published. Burckhardt was encouraging, though somewhat alienated by the work that Nietzsche began to produce, around the period of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, for example. But Nietzsche, for his part, never lost his admiration for Burckhardt, writing, even in his final year, in Twilight of Idols, that Burckhardt was perhaps alone among the German classicists as a man who refused to deceive himself about the nature of the ancient world. It's well known that Burckhardt was influential in Nietzsche's view of the Greeks. In Burckhardt's work, he drew attention to aspects of the Greek world that had been ignored, especially by those among the classicists who had tried to cast the Greeks in a humanist light, or portray them as a forerunner of Enlightenment Europe, or even Christian civilization itself. And these views were not uncommon. You could find them among the classicists, Winckelmann, Wolff. You could find views like this among German Hellenists like Goethe and Schiller. You can even find it in the work of liberal universalists like Matthew Arnold. But Burckhardt argued that the Greeks established their city-states through extreme violence. These cities were, as a rule, governed by aristocracies, and even the most democratic among the Greek city-states still kept slaves, still disenfranchised most of those that they governed. Rather than being a culture of literature and higher enlightenment, Burckhardt argued that the Greeks didn't even believe in objective truth in the way that we think about it, and that they patterned their lives on myth and ritual. They made every political dispute into a religious one, meaning that even their partisan disagreements within the cities could take on the horror of religious wars, as he puts it. We can recognize the influence on Nietzsche as regards many of these interpretations, but perhaps even more importantly, as far as establishing their friendship, Jacob Burckhardt, like Nietzsche, was a Schopenhauerian, and thus they shared many of the same views on life and history. Now, as we all know, Nietzsche would eventually change his views on Schopenhauer, and he would reject what he saw as Schopenhauer's world-weary pessimism. But Burckhardt never did, and that perhaps explains why the two men drifted from one another later in their lives. But what is strange is that Nietzsche never turns about and criticizes Burckhardt, as he does with, for example, Schopenhauer or Wagner. Instead, he seems to believe that Burckhardt deep down knows the same truths that Nietzsche does. But he believes that Burckhardt hides this behind a mask, that his classical, cool-headed temperament is a mask. And the allegory of the mask, as Nietzsche uses it in Beyond Good and Evil, is very interesting to consider in light of his comments about Burckhardt. He writes in his notes in 1875 that Burckhardt remained restrained but out of desperation, and he writes in Beyond Good and Evil of, quote, scholarly men who make use of scholarship because it gives them a classically serene facade, and because scholarship suggests the conclusion that the man is superficial. They wish that people should arrive at the wrong conclusion about them, end quote. Now, again, the reason why this is strange is when we consider that Nietzsche had no problem accepting that his heroes and his mentors could be fundamentally wrong, at least from his point of view. This didn't seem to undermine Nietzsche's identity in any way. He rejects Schopenhauer. He still respects him. He still returns to Schopenhauer's ideas throughout his life, but he makes scathing criticisms of Schopenhauer, and he eventually turns against Schopenhauer on pretty much all the major points of Schopenhauer's philosophy. He rejects Wagner, and he writes critically and sometimes scathingly about Wagner as well, in a way that's actually more extreme than with Schopenhauer, because he had a personal friendship with Wagner, which he broke off from. In other words, Nietzsche was not one to deceive himself into believing that someone that he dearly admires simply has to secretly share his views. He was perfectly fine with attacking his influences or saying outright where he thought they'd gone wrong. So why the difference with Burckhardt? Why did Nietzsche always suspect that Burckhardt was, deep down, for lack of a better word, a Nietzschean, and simply hid this reality behind a mask? Well, if we're going to form any opinion on that, we need to know a bit more about Jacob Burckhardt and his life philosophy. The friendship between Burckhardt and Nietzsche is the topic of yet another excursion in Erich Heller's book, The Disinherited Mind, an exploration of the hazard of modern poetry. If we'll recall, the thesis of this book is that at the birth of modernity, the symbolic and the real became separated. That this is the condition of the modern mind, and in some way this almost could be said to define modernity. The real becomes strictly what is measurable, quantifiable, empirical, perhaps what is useful or practical, and the symbolic becomes pure fantasy. That is to say, meaning becomes detached from the real world. Meaning becomes a subjective fiction, a mere interpretation imposed on reality. Art and science become completely separate spheres of human activity. And while in some ways each appears to be strengthened by this divorce, because both can sort of run free without being checked by the other sphere, both spheres also become deranged to some extent. On the one hand, in that science begins to create this numerical, abstract, meaningless worldview. We might say a worldview with an allergy to ontology, so there's this anti-ontological stance in science. You can't address yourself to the question of being, to what it really is or what it really means. And on the other hand, appearance, beauty, ideals, subjective judgments about reality are relegated to the irrational or to the imagination, and art and poetry begin to lose their place in modern society. Science tells us what it is, but not what it means. Art and poetry purportedly tell us what it all means, the whys of life, but seemingly with no connection to reality. And this is just as deranged of an outcome for art as for science. Heller makes it clear that he's not saying that we need to throw ourselves into art and romanticism in order to cure this ailment. If anything, romanticism is the evil twin of rationalism. Neither one is a sufficient way of viewing the world. And in some way, we can relate this development to the death of God, as Nietzsche would have put it, because religion was in some sense the thing that linked the symbol and the real together. Again, we can think of the medieval view of the Holy Communion, in which the symbols of Christ's body and blood actually are the real thing. Burckhardt struggled with this issue as fervently as any poet, but he does so in a different arena. Goethe struggled with the meaning of the symbol and its relation to the real in the realm of science. Burckhardt struggled with it in the realm of history. Burckhardt, like many classicists, was fascinated by the Italian Renaissance, the time in which the interest in the classical world was revived, so to speak. And he wrote a book called The Culture of the Renaissance in Italy. And in that work, he relates colorful stories from Perugia, the city of Raphael, at the time when Raphael was living there. And in the Renaissance, we have this wonderful contrast between the fact that there were these absolute geniuses living in these competing city-states, and there's also this backdrop of constant violence and civil unrest and assassinations and scandalous immorality, starkly counterposed against religious piety. So you have worldly ambition and sin and holiness and reverence and all of these things, and you have genius and, the heights of the intellect and also the most base desires, right? All sort of mixed together. In many ways, the Italian Renaissance could remind you of the very conditions of ancient Greece, the civilization that they sort of rediscovered during this time, because the Greeks also produce all of these intellectual and artistic geniuses, and yet they're riven by violent rivalries and brutal wars and revolutions and so on. So one of the stories that Burckhardt relates in that text is from the Chronicles of Matarazzo, and it perfectly encapsulates the fascinating spirit of these times. Quote, Burckhardt tells the story of Atalanta, the beautiful mother of Grifone Baglione, who was for some time ruling prince of Perugia. He had fought his way to power against rival members of his own family. His mother Atalanta was on the side of his enemies. On her son's victory, she cursed him and fled from the city. But Grifone's rule was short-lived. He was soon overpowered by his rivals and mortally wounded. When Atalanta heard he was dying, she returned with her daughter-in-law. At the approach of the two ladies, the tumultuous crowd on the piazza parted, both fearing the wrath of the bereaved mother. She, however, went straight to her son, and far from contemplating further violence, implored him to forgive those who had dealt the deadly blow. After he had thus renounced the spirit of revenge, he died with the blessings of his mother. Then the two women left the city again, and the crowd, partisans of both camps, knelt down and wept as they crossed the piazza in their blood-stained garments. It was for this Atalanta that Raphael later painted his Deposizione. Thus Burckhardt writes, quote, her own suffering was laid at the feet of the most sublime and sacred agony of a mother. End quote. After all this, the Cathedral of Perugia, which had stood in the midst of these many scenes of felony and murder, was washed with wine and consecrated anew. Anecdotes of this kind occur frequently in Jacob Burckhardt's book on the Renaissance, which was first published in Basel in 1860, when its author had reached the age of 42. Are they, the historian of today may ask, worthy of a self-respecting scholar? Have they not the romantic flavor of a fanciful dramatization rather than the authentic ring of precise recording? What is the value of a source like Matarazzo's Chronicles? Was he not a partisan himself, bent upon building up a heroic reputation for the Baglioni, and at the same time a storyteller determined to entertain and edify his public rather than instruct it? End quote. So by today's standards, Jacob Burckhardt would probably be called a romantic-style historian. And here, I don't necessarily mean romanticism as a philosophy, but as a tendency, the way that people can sort of apply this term, as just a tendency in thought or in temperament, a desire to present a compelling story from the past or about the past, usually drawing upon some of the traditional tropes and myths from that past, and a willingness perhaps to proceed with less rigor than usual because there's something contained in the story that presents an image of life at that time. And that image is perhaps truer in the sense of conveying to us the so-called spirit of the times or something like that than a purely factual account would be. So he draws upon the chronicles of Matarazzo and these figures which appear in the art of Raphael, and they're immortalized into a kind of ideal, perhaps, an artistic truth about the meaning of the times. And not purely as a fiction, but as a revelation of what the people in those times thought, the stories that they told. Now, is the historian's job to painstakingly interrogate those stories or to uncritically repeat those stories? Is it even history to take a partisan like Matarazzo and his chronicles and, knowing full well that he's attempting to glorify the house of the Baglionis, is it really within historical scruples to simply take him at his word? We discussed this whole dynamic a bit in the episode on Nietzsche's first lecture and that sort of Goethean view of history. Is it worth preserving a good story, an inspiring story, as a kind of monument? However we weigh in on these issues, we have that fault line again between the symbolic and the real. We could put it this way: Burckhardt, as a historian, is willing to convey a symbolic accounting of history, or to hold that ethos of the symbolic meaning above the strictly objective truth. Heller writes, quote, what is the picture produced in our minds by these unverified, perhaps unverifiable anecdotes? It is composed of intense evil and sublime beauty, of hatred and charity, of degradation and purification, of the unscrupulousness that inflicts pain and the reverence felt for suffering, of sin, contrition, and atonement. Indeed, the source from which it springs is not chosen for the sake of factual exactitude. Its authority is of a different nature. It has, for Burckhardt, the authenticity of the mind, imagination, and spirit of the Renaissance, and if it yields a negligible quantity of reliable facts, it nevertheless reveals something important to him, the quality of the life of the period, or as he would have called it, the Geist of the epoch. To reproduce this is what he calls history of culture as distinct from political history, end quote. So Burckhardt recognizes that this society transformed these figures from ordinary people into ideals in their collective imagination. The ambitious, power-seeking woman becomes the archetypal sacred mother, just as brutal warlords of the period are transformed by Raphael into the righteous warriors of heaven. And that reveals more about the Renaissance culture than the political history, the recitation of dates and events, and who was on what side, and their motivations, and the economics of it all, and so on and so forth. That's the kind of history that Burckhardt wished to convey, was the culture, the ideals. And I think most of us recognize that art falsifies the world in that way. That is what Raphael was doing, conveying the spirit of events and the spirit of the times, rather than, quote, the pure abstract of an event, which is, in fact, no event whatsoever. For something that happens becomes an event only when it is mentally and emotionally perceived and registered, end quote. So put simply, we don't hold the artist to the standard that he paint only what really happened, and Matarazzo, and with him Burckhardt, are not chronicling history in order to recount only what really happened. There's simply a different goal here. Burckhardt himself wrote about this, declaring that he was equally concerned with, quote, represented history as with what, quote, literally happened, end quote. And Heller adds to this, quote, forgetting that nothing happens literally, unless we are determined to make our own perception the criterion of the perception of truth itself, end quote. So, for example, when Burckhardt writes about Aeneas Sylvius, he says, you can distrust his accounts completely, and yet the picture of the age that he conveys is, quote, reflected with such perception and liveliness, end quote. Furthermore, he doesn't believe that by accumulating many different perspectives and accounts, one could actually come closer to some sort of objective truth out of the amalgam of these. Because, in fact, the vision of one sufficiently perceptive mind, that might ultimately be a truer vision than the amalgamated vision of a slew of observers who all lack such perception, and then we just kind of average out their vision, which was lacking in perception, right? A million zeros don't ever equal to one, in other words. So just by getting more perspectives, and, even if they happen to agree with one another, you're not actually proceeding closer to the truth that way. That thought tendency in Burckhardt makes him something of an enigma, because Heller points out, Burckhardt is not a romantic in a naive sense. He was by temperament a rather skeptical thinker. Furthermore, he had no personal investment in upholding these stories about, the beauty of Christian faith or virtue, because Burckhardt himself was a non-believer. Burckhardt's father had been a minister in the Protestant church, and he'd been expected to follow in his father's footsteps and become a theologian. And exactly as it happened with Nietzsche, he abandoned his studies in theology and turned to classical philology, study of the ancient world. And as a further similarity between him and Nietzsche, both of them turned to the ancient world after being convinced through their own exploration of the facts, through their reason, right, that the stories surrounding Christ were largely a myth. For Nietzsche, it was a book by David Strauss. For Burckhardt, it was his teacher, De Wet. But in any case, Burckhardt was not a credulous type of person, nor was he personally committed to Christian dogma. His heroic and monumental historical portraits of figures from the Renaissance are instead an attempt to rescue the history of culture with a somewhat poetic infusion into history, we might say, the infusion of the symbol. And we've already mentioned Goethe, but there's another important connection to Goethe here. And both Burckhardt and Nietzsche were Goetheans, or for whatever that might mean, both influenced by him. But Goethe said that the important thing in interpreting events is that one perceives and feels the connection between the particular and the universal, the unity of the idea and the event. What is important is one's view, one's vision. That's what reveals the truth of the event in question. And so Burckhardt wrote, quote, "I am lost where I cannot begin with Anschauung," end quote. We could translate this term as vision. There's more nuance than that. As Heller writes, quote, "It means the mental process by which we spontaneously grasp, through observation, aided by intuition, a thing in its wholeness." Goethe uses it as the opposite of analysis, the mental approach which he feared would establish itself as the dominant habit of an age fascinated by Newtonian physics, only to destroy all culture of the intellect, end quote. So Burckhardt's method, his place of beginning, is, with Goethe, vision, seeing. This is the activity of beginning from the unity as revealed in the impression, that is spontaneously grasped with the aid of the intuition. We could recall Goethe's idea of the Urphänomen, the phenomenon understood as this unity that we intuit upon perceiving the phenomenon, beyond which any analysis will prove to be unfruitful or useless or even counterproductive, that the truth, in other words, the idea, can be revealed by perception, and that it's from that kind of philosophy that Burckhardt operates. And thus, one might be justified in asking, does Burckhardt's philosophy of history place poetry, so to speak, above knowledge, or above history as history as science? And the answer is yes. Burckhardt believed that Schopenhauer had accurately ranked poetry above history, considered as an objective science of history, as representing a better route to the truth, that one could more sufficiently grasp the truth, considered in this Goethean way of seeing the truth, the unity that you perceive through Anschauung, by perceiving the spirit of the age in a series of, say, verses, or in a painting by Raphael, or in one of Matarazzo's stories. You would perceive the spirit of the age there rather than in the political history or the minute details of the age, the factual details. And so we have to ask, why did Schopenhauer make that kind of judgment, placing poetry higher than history as a route to truth? And fundamentally, the answer is that Schopenhauer doesn't really believe in history, at least not in the way that most of us modern people do. And there are two levels on which I could explain this, or on which I'll try to explain this. One is sort of an ontological reason for thinking this, insofar as Schopenhauer has a certain philosophical conception of being, and that he thinks all beings are really will, and this will is timeless and spaceless, and so it lacks any divisions or distinctions or separateness. It's really just one thing. It's not even that, but for the purposes of explanation, it's one thing, right? So these divisions of will come from our representations. The division of this monism into separate things exists on the level of our representation of the world, not in the world itself. In other words, our minds fracture the world into phenomena, but on the level of noumena, the world as such, it's one unchanging thing. So, philosophically speaking, that has implications for Schopenhauer's view of history. History is not, in actuality, this progression of people and events. Rather, the actual character of being, which is will, is timeless and eternal. Its nature, in all its forms, is to strive to live, and in our striving we represent this notion of a progression in time as part of that world of phenomena, or rather as the precondition of it. And so I just thought I'd give this first sort of explanation because this is like a really deep-seated conviction or value in Schopenhauer of the conviction that there is fundamentally an eternality and unity to all being, which precludes any change. But on another level, I think the illusory nature of the chronological progression of history is something that both Burckhardt and Schopenhauer intuitively perceive not as a statement about, not just strictly as a statement about the nature of being itself, but about human beings, insofar as they see all history as various representations of the strivings of men, and mankind itself has remained the same throughout the ages. The eras come and go, but the same dramas play out. Empires rise and fall. How little does man himself actually change? The very fact that we can easily recognize ourselves in the lives and deeds of ancient peoples reveals this fact. And this is why if somebody wishes to draw out a philosophy of history, Schopenhauer writes that a study of Herodotus is sufficient. So everything you need to know about history is already in Herodotus. Or as Nietzsche himself wrote in one of his untimely meditations, still a Schopenhauerian period of Nietzsche's thought, quote, "How could the next 10 years teach what the past 10 were not able to teach?" End quote. And this strikes at the heart of Schopenhauer's antipathy for Hegel, by the way, this view of history, because Hegel saw the creation of a philosophy of history as the goal, as it were, the highest achievement of the history of philosophy. In other words, throughout its whole existence, philosophy has attempted to unveil the truth in its long dialectic. It's revealed that the truth is only known in appearance, and appearance is constantly moving, constantly changing, right? What is a truth that doesn't manifest in the world? A truth that doesn't appear to us? What would that even be? And in this phenomenal world, we find that phenomena are not eternal forms. This is a world of impermanence. So the Hegelians locate the truth within change, within history, within the development, within the appearance, which is always changing and developing and moving. And because, really, you would have to ask the question, if you perceive that about the world, is it all meaningless change or change with no end and no goal? Well, the Hegelians would say no, because the very fact that we have come to know these things reveals that we know more now, that we are closer to the truth than we were, which means that the truth is revealing itself throughout the course of history. And you could even say this is a negative revelation, right? We've learned that the truth is not an eternal fact, perhaps the way that Kant might have thought about noumenon, right? But that reveals something to us about the moving nature, the dynamic nature of truth, the historical nature of truth. And that in and of itself means we now have a greater grasp on truth than previous generations before. And this is a very vulgar oversimplification of Hegel, but that this is in a way the revelation of the truth of progress, of the truth revealing itself through the course of history, is that in the dialectic the truth is steadily revealed to a greater and greater degree. But in contrast, Schopenhauer would say the truth is not something that progresses or develops. No, the truth is eternal. What we have are, in fact, just different representations of that same truth, which speak to the differing perspectives and perceptions of those doing the representing, and we might think of Burckhardt's notion of doing, quote, representational history in light of the Schopenhauerian meaning of the term representation. So when Burckhardt rendered the spirit of the age in his book on the Renaissance, that picture, that vision, that representation is how the world appeared to the men of the Renaissance. It's telling us about them as people. Hegel would say that the people of the Renaissance, in their perspective, they're at a certain place in history in this progression, in this dialectical revelation of the truth, that they're a step on the road of progress. But Schopenhauer would say, no, there's no progression. Schopenhauer writes, quote, "The Hegelians who regard the philosophy of history as the aim of all philosophy ought to be taught some Plato, who indefatigably repeats that the object of philosophy lies in the unchangeable and in what lasts, and not in things which are now like this and now again like that. All those who postulate such constructions about the world in motion, or as they call it, history, have not grasped the fundamental truth of philosophy. That philosophically speaking, what really is the same at all times. The fools, however, believe that it will develop and one day arrive. Thus they regard the whirling world as they perceive it as the ultimate reality and see its final meaning in a meager bliss on earth, which, even if cultivated evermore by man and favored by fate, will remain a hollow, deceptive, fickle and sorry thing, of which nothing essentially better can ever come through either constitutions or legal codes or steam engines or telegraphs. A real philosophy of history ought to bear in mind what forever is and never develops. It can indeed not consist in raising the temporal aims of man to the rank of absolutes, and furthermore in constructing in an artificial and fanciful insight that, in all those endless variations and turmoils, we have before us merely the one creature, essentially identical and unchangeable, busying itself with the very same things today and yesterday and tomorrow, end quote. So that's the undivided, ceaseless, eternal will. That much is obvious. Notice the language, the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Schopenhauer's eternal will bears that in common, at least with the Christian conception of God. And that was really Hegel's innovation, actually, is to make the absolute, the divine, something revealed in the world of change. And that's why Schopenhauer says the Hegelians are really bad Christians. And, Schopenhauer was an atheist. Why would he make such a point? Well, on the one level, you could say that a key part of Christianity is acknowledging the dissatisfactoriness of this world and the fact that the promise truly does lie within an other world in which things are eternal. The eternality of the promise of heaven and the promise of the communion with God would seem to be an essential part of the Christian religion. But Schopenhauer also believed, even though he was an atheist, in the philosophical truth beneath Christianity, even if he didn't believe the religion itself was literally true, again, to use that word or that term. Burckhardt wholeheartedly agreed with Schopenhauer on this. He wrote in his reflections on world history, quote, "Religions are the expression of the eternal and indestructible metaphysical need of human nature," end quote. And of course, that's Schopenhauer's phrase there, the metaphysical need, right? That the common person with their lack of perception and their lack of vision, they have a metaphysics, but religion is their metaphysics, right? And the Christian religion, like all great spiritual traditions, contained in its ascetic ideal a guidepost. And this guidepost leads to the negation of the will, which is salvation in Schopenhauer's system. The repudiation of striving in the world, acting according to these temporal aims, as he calls them here, and instead turning your attention to the eternal. This is sort of the brilliant paradox at the heart of Schopenhauer's system, using the will to negate the will, applying our discipline to become master of ourselves, master of one's own passions, and thus ceasing to desire the things in the world of representation. And this perhaps helps to explain what Burckhardt saw as admirable in those fanciful tales of Matarazzo. He didn't credulously believe in romantic tales of Christian virtue, but saw in them a deeper truth, that interplay of good and evil, revenge and forgiveness, this spiritual drama of the human condition, and the salvation that comes with the resignation of the will. These stories, in other words, reveal truths that will be true forever. And we don't learn from them by somehow acquiring new information that progresses us to a better society or something. Rather, there's an eternal truth already in them that's accessible already and was accessible at every time in the past and will be in the future. The wise from all ages already knew it. Burckhardt writes, quote, "Our point of departure is the one and only thing which lasts in history and is its only possible center. Man, this suffering, striving, and active being, as he is and was, and will be forever. The philosophers of history see the past in opposition and as a preliminary to us as the more developed. We shall study what is recurrent, constant, and typical, as echoing in us and to be understood by us." End quote. So, to see the world as the men of the Renaissance saw it is to see something recurrent and constant that echoes in us. And so Burckhardt, following Schopenhauer, rejects Christianity, and he rejects it mostly on a factual basis. He rejects the life of Jesus as a historical event, or the stories surrounding Jesus about the miracles and the resurrection and so on. And so in the modern sense of the word history, he would say that historically speaking, Jesus did not rise from the dead and did not do these miracles. But Heller writes that Burckhardt believed instead, quote, "an order of things identical with that accepted by the Christian believer, to look upon man, as Schopenhauer and Burckhardt did, as the fallen creature, on sin and evil as constituent and ineradicable factors in human history, on human affairs as pathological, without believing in the reality, existence, possibility, and indeed the definite offer of spiritual health, must needs create a profound spiritual predicament." End quote. In other words, the falseness of historical progress is much easier to absorb into your worldview when there is Christ the Redeemer, as a real promise, a real end to the entire story. If you don't believe in that, if you can't believe in the literal truth, the historical truth of Christianity, but only that the values of Christianity, its moral order, will lead people to the best kind of life and the best kind of orientation toward the world, well, on some level, that's a very unsatisfying vision of reality. It's an unsatisfying judgment to make about the whole affair of religion and morality and so on, and the human condition. Because after all, that worldview precludes the possibility that we could ever progress to a state of affairs where more and more people, or perhaps everyone, comes to realize the truth, right? Because error and ignorance, sin and suffering are part of the eternal story, and it never gets better, it never improves or develops. You're left with a bit of a dead end. And one wonders where the motivation for creativity or for productivity of any kind might come from, given such a worldview. Why do anything in this world which is fundamentally unsatisfying and empty and impermanent? Even the wisdom that you gain can't really be expected to be accepted and taken in by the majority of the populace. So, what the Hegelians have going for them is that they have a story to history. There's an end to history that shall be realized on earth and the world. This is, in a way, a derivation or an innovation on the Christian story, that it will be realized in an other world or after the revelation, whatever, the apocalypse, whatever it might be. And I suppose you could say, if you take away sort of both of those things and you still hold that life is just this sort of cyclical story, there's one eternal truth at the center of it, but people don't really change, what's to stop you from falling into nihilism here? To put this issue another way, Nietzsche believed that the metaphysical need, as Schopenhauer put it, was not a need at all. In fact, Nietzsche believed it was the expression of a desire that could not actually be fulfilled. The desire for truth, the will to truth. Schopenhauer reasoned from the premise that people had this desire for metaphysical truth to the conclusion that such metaphysical truth must exist, or else we would not desire for it. And Nietzsche completely disagreed on that front. He believed, in fact, we had developed a desire for something that could not really be satisfied. And this had made man, quote, the diseased animal, end quote, or, quote, the skin disease of the earth. Nietzsche longed for a new kind of person, therefore. For example, in his second preface to Birth of Tragedy, he says, the kind of person who will no longer seek his comfort in metaphysics at all. That's one of the things that Nietzsche's Overman will get over, one of the things about man that the Overman will get over. But this flies in the face of Burckhardt's worldview, Nietzsche's entire project of the Overman. And this is really the heart of the fracture between the two, who agreed on so much when they were colleagues together at Basel. Nietzsche's philosophy is not timeless. He rejects the eternal and unchanging will of Schopenhauer as a monism, and he writes a philosophy of the future, addressed to the future and with hopes for the future. So his philosophy is aimed at the future. But the goal for Nietzsche is changing man himself, not changing the social system, not revealing some intellectual or metaphysical truth. Rather, mankind itself shall be improved. That is the possibility for some change, for some transformation of what life is. The development of a new kind of physiology, and thus a totally new psychology that transcends all of the current pathologies of consciousness, while still carrying through that consciousness as a very valuable thing. Now, of course, there are other elements in Nietzsche's thought that contradict this, right? There's the amor fati. There's this idea of wanting nothing to be different, wanting everything, accepting the necessity of everything. And, of course, there's also the issue of the eternal return. And we're going to talk about that in a moment, but I just wanted to point out first that Nietzsche's idea of the Overman, his concept of eternal return, and his moral nihilism, much of what he wrote about nihilism, none of this really interested Jacob Burckhardt. The Overman, after all, is beyond good and evil. It's like this transcendence of sin and suffering and pathology, frankly, a transcendence of evil. And Burckhardt saw all of those things as key to history. He holds that evil is real. Heller writes, quote, "The evil which Burckhardt perceives in history, and he perceives more evil in it than good, he freely calls by its name," end quote. And there's another passage where Burckhardt says, the fact that good things sometimes come out of evil actions and events, that, we might recall Nietzsche's writings, that some of the noblest things in human life can grow from the basest origins. Burckhardt explicitly says, just the fact that good consequences came out of a horrible thing does not actually undo the evil. The evil is still evil, even if it leads to something good. And the eternal return, I would argue, far from a capitulation to the eternality of things from the Schopenhauerian perspective, if there's just one thing and it never changes. The eternal return is really the belief that all of the events spanning throughout time, throughout history, that whirling world that Schopenhauer kind of dismissively talks about, are not mere representations. Actually, they are the eternal facts. In other words, Nietzsche makes every fleeting thing eternal with his eternal return. He does not say that every fleeting thing is unreal and there's an underlying eternal truth. No, he says he wishes to stamp becoming with the character of being, and that, quote, "My consolation is that everything that has been is eternal," end quote. So that makes the fleeting real, making the appearance real. It's far closer to Hegel than to Schopenhauer. And most problematic of all is Nietzsche's contention that with the death of God, the only possible development is a coming nihilism, that this desacralization of the world, the disenchantment of the world that comes with modernity, brings with it a devaluation. And Heller writes, quote, "Nietzsche was more deeply wounded by the loss of positive religious convictions than Burckhardt, which is as much to say that his nature was more in need of an articulate religious faith," end quote. And that's exactly what Nietzsche has to reconstruct, and thus spoke Zarathustra. He has to rebuke the order of things as it was presented by Christianity. Remember that Burckhardt still believes in, but Nietzsche rejects it because it has revealed itself to be insufficient, because, as he said, the highest values have devalued themselves. But he creates a new mythology. He creates a new religion based on a new set of values. And so in all of this, I think we can see the source of Nietzsche's disbelief at his old friend Burckhardt, a man who he did not believe could deceive himself, and yet who wears this mask, this pretension that he gives to everyone else of being able to rest in this resignationist philosophy, this Christian moral order that manifestly is delivering Europe to nihilism. But maybe it wasn't delivering all Europe to nihilism. I mean, Heller points out maybe this is a confession of Nietzsche. Maybe it just is threatening to deliver Nietzsche to nihilism. And Burckhardt is simply of a different temperament. He's able to disbelieve in the facticity of Christianity while holding on to it as a symbol or an ideal or a monument or something like that. And Nietzsche, for whatever reason, can't believe that. He can't believe that Burckhardt can't see what he sees, that it's precisely by holding on to that, by clinging to the shipwreck of Christianity, you're actually preventing mankind from changing. And that's that fundamental sort of difference between them, the idea of whether or not mankind can change or whether mankind is eternal and always the same and nothing develops at all. And for Burckhardt, therefore, Heller makes the case that history itself is it's an object of contemplation. It's a way for Burckhardt to achieve that state of becoming a will-less subject of knowing. That was Schopenhauer's concept of deliverance from the world as will, by contemplating the representations as representation and not as the object of one's will. So for Schopenhauer, this is done through contemplation of, for example, art. Schopenhauer's favorite painters are the Dutch landscape painters. And, in their calm, still beauty, you can enter the sublime and find yourself in the pure contemplation of form, of image, and therefore you're temporarily at least delivered from the tempestuous will. And Heller argues That's what history is for Burckhardt. This is why he, at one point in his life, thought he could have become a poet. He once explored that possibility, but ultimately he becomes this kind of poetic historian who wishes to distill these representations from history for the sake of contemplation. And Burckhardt pretty much says this outright. Quote, "Contemplation is not only the right and duty of the historian, it is also a supreme need. It is our freedom from the very awareness of universal bondage and in the stream of necessities." End quote. So the contemplation of history as a way to free oneself from universal bondage, the fact that we're all bound by the ever-striving will, that's what causes all human suffering, is our own desires. So we can see in that Burckhardt, he holds with Schopenhauerian metaphysics in his view of history, but also the moral end of Schopenhauer's outlook. That's also Burckhardt's use for history. And indeed, he expresses the Schopenhauerian ideal of negating the will to live. This is actually in one of his letters, and he says it with utter frankness, quote, "At every moment I would be prepared to exchange my life for a never having been," end quote. And how Schopenhauerian can you get, really? And so I would argue that eventually Nietzsche comes around to understanding that it's not a matter of Burckhardt somehow intellectually realizing that Nietzsche is right, but choosing to hide his spiritual crisis behind a mask. As he says in Twilight of Idols, the value of life cannot be decided upon. It can't be judged fairly. Whether one says yes or no to life, this is a matter of instinct for that person. And while he's referring to Schopenhauer in that passage, perhaps that comes with a recognition that Burckhardt simply had a different set of instincts. Or maybe that was the very thing that Nietzsche just couldn't believe, that Burckhardt, this man that he looked up to, all the way to the end of his lucidity, this man that they shared a love for the tragic pessimism of the Greeks. They saw the Greeks for what they really were. Could this really be a man of declining instincts? Could he really be a pessimist? It must all be an act. Heller's final words on the relationship between Burckhardt and Nietzsche suggest that perhaps Burckhardt did retain something of a theologian's faith after all, that there was something that Burckhardt leaned on that went beyond the reprieve he gained from this evil world and the cool-headed contemplation of history. Heller writes, quote, "His purely aesthetic faith was not the only source that sustained his soul. There was, though it remained inarticulate, much left in him of a faith which has a profounder reach. In his reflections on world history, contemplating the power and the success of evil, and power he regarded as forever predominantly evil, and Napoleon he called a personified absurdity, he dismisses the comfort which the Hegelian assumption of a historical master plan for the world may give. Every successful wickedness, he says, is, to say the least of it, a scandal. And he adds, the only lesson to be derived from the successful misdeeds of the strong is to hold life here and now in no higher esteem than it deserves. And once, concluding one of his lectures about Greek art with some reflections on the sadness expressed in the faces of the marble images of Greek gods, he made the Vatican Hermes say, "You are astonished that I am so sad? I, one of the Olympians, living in perpetual bliss and immortal joy? Indeed, we possessed everything: glory, heavenly beauty, eternal youth, everlasting pleasure. And yet we were not happy. We lived only for ourselves and inflicted suffering on all others. We were not good, and hence we had to perish." This is not the language of a rhapsodist of beauty. It rather sounds like the echo of the voice of Jacob Burckhardt, Sr., vicar of the Minster of Basel. End quote. Our final excursion of this episode, and therefore the last topic of the podcast for this entire season, concerns Nietzsche and Goethe. And though Erich Heller's Disinherited Mind goes on after this chapter and covers many other writers, I think this exploration of how Nietzsche responded to Goethe will provide the best possible ending for this series, because it brings the problem into full view. And even if Heller doesn't think Nietzsche or Goethe really solved anything, I think one of the things you can take away from Heller's book is that these issues are not quote-unquote solved. in some sort of rational manner that can be applied universally. Because again, that's the scientific mode of thinking divorced from the sphere of poetry and myth. And within that sphere, one would have to recognize, as Goethe does, that belief is what's required. Belief is not established as a rational proposition, but as something one directly perceives in that manner of Anschauung. And I think when it comes to our deeply held convictions, our valuations and judgments, our fundamental picture of what the world is and what our place in it is, no science can ever answer that. As difficult as it is to translate Anschauung into English, I think we can comprehend it perfectly well in those terms when considered from the point of view of a religious faith or a strongly held conviction where somebody just sees things a certain way and can't unsee them, can't logically argue themselves out of seeing things that way. Their direct perception reveals a unity to them, a striking coherence, a sudden making sense of the world that's almost beyond words. And that's why Goethe writes, quote, "The one and only real profound theme of the world and of human history, a theme to which all others are subordinate, remains the conflict between belief and unbelief. All epochs dominated by belief in whatever shape have a radiance and bliss of their own, and bear fruit for their people as well as for posterity. All epochs over which unbelief in whatever form maintains its miserable victory, even if they boast and shine for a while with false splendor, are ignored by posterity, because nobody likes to drudge his life out over sterile things." End quote. So the key issue for Goethe is belief, but this raises the question as to what belief means exactly. And that quote, in context, is about the time the Hebrews spend wandering in the desert and their struggles with the choice of whether to hold on to their faith or abandon it or give in to idol worship and so on. But one might raise the objection, again, that Goethe is not a believer, not in any form of Christianity that we would recognize. He's very similar to Burckhardt in that way. It's sort of the same question, right? Because Goethe is a pantheist. He's inspired by Spinoza and by his Hellenism and the Greek philosophers, but above all because of his perception of the unity of nature. That was his conviction. But it's not part of any broader religious tradition or culture. Again, Goethe has that very individualized attitude towards spirituality and his personal beliefs. So, like Burckhardt, Goethe upholds the power of the image, the ideal, the belief, without holding to the particular traditions of his culture. He's expressing something about the power of belief in general, that each epoch has this kind of, as he says, radiance and bliss of their own. And that might remind us of, for example, Nietzsche's 1001 Goals, the passage in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Each people that Nietzsche mentions in that passage has their tablet of values. That tablet was the voice of their good and evil, the source of their splendor and grandeur, and the greatest power that they possess. Zarathustra finds no power on earth greater than good and evil. And so, the Persians, the Greeks, the Hebrews, they all have their different values, their different beliefs, a different image of the divine, but each such image is their power, so to speak. And that's the basis of Nietzsche's revaluation of values. It comes as part of the recognition of the need for such a tablet of values, of the power of values. But let's remember the lines of Hölderlin that we quoted in the first part. The gods, our image of the divine, now seem to live far away. We seem to live in these spiritless times. Perhaps a great deal of the problem with interpreting Nietzsche is that many people will be unable to believe in his trans-historical project, his revaluation of values. That would have to be embodied in the Overman as a new highest value, which is a thing we don't know. You have to have a faith in the Overman. You can't know that the Overman's going to come. And so those types of people tend to therefore read him as a positivist, or simply, they proceed only as far as Nietzsche's nihilism without saying yes to anything, and, rebuke Nietzsche for being entirely too irrational and too contradictory or too mythological, if you will. And perhaps there's an opposite type who's so sick of the scientific rationalism of modernity, they just want to throw themselves wholly into a new myth, to escape from it all. But they don't really want to first do the work of the active nihilism, of critiquing and reevaluating the old beliefs. They just drop one faith, like the stale faith of modernism, and adopt another one. Let's return to Greek paganism. That's the point of Nietzsche. And oftentimes, because belief is not subject to the will in the simple sense, that you actually have to know something is true or feel something is true, that Goethean vision for what's true, right? Oftentimes this just becomes merely a phase that people move on from, that kind of Nietzscheanism, because it's untenable. And so even within the ways that people interpret Nietzsche, we can see this romanticism and rationalism as, again, sort of evil twins. Whereas I think what both Goethe and Nietzsche, if I may dare to risk the hypothesis, I think both were looking for some sort of unification of those two. Now, Goethe, in one of the places in his work, gives his own account of how we arrived at this current age. It's his language for talking about these spiritless times and of the hazard of modern poetry. He lays out a conception of what he calls the intellectual ages of civilization, which Heller sees as a prefiguration of Spengler's morphology of the epochs of history. Goethe says that the history of the intellectual ages begins with the word. As the Gospels tell us, after all, in the beginning was the word, the logos. Now, obviously, humans lived and probably even had something akin to culture prior to this, but Goethe argues this prehistory doesn't really constitute an intellectual era because there's no written or spoken communication, so there's no intellectualizing about it. So the way that Goethe sees it, there are 4 eras, broadly speaking. The age of poetry, the age of theology or holiness, the age of philosophy or science, and the age of prose. We might render the name of that last age more cynically as the prosaic age. The word prosaic is normally used as kind of a put-down for something, something surface level, something that's unremarkable. But its real meaning is unpoetic in a literal sense, right? So the negative connotation is like it's writing that it lacks depth, it lacks insight, it lacks that infusion of meaning or the symbol entirely. It merely conveys facts, it's surface-level data or information. And so most of us don't automatically have a negative connotation with the term prose. Most of us read prose primarily, but there's a reason why the term prosaic is negative because, again, in the past, the great works of art were, in former times, works of poetry, where every line of your play or your verses had to be suffused with meaning and with emotional weight and with artfulness in its arrangement, an economy of language and rhythm and so on. The coming of the prosaic would seem to be a step down from that, from the age of poetry. But let's go through these ages. The age of poetry, in Goethe's estimation, is the beginning of man's communicative faculties. It's where art and knowledge, religion and reality, these clashing spheres of human life, they're not yet separated. So we experience them as clashing, but they're totally unified in this age. And Heller quotes from one of Nietzsche's notes where he agrees with this assessment, and by the way, I think most anthropologists would too, quote, "There must have been a time when the religious, aesthetic, and moral perceptions were at one," end quote. And this is, roughly speaking, the condition, the state of mind of the poetic age. Words are discovered as this new power, and there's an awareness that words are power, that they can transform reality in some very real sense. And we might correlate this age with ancient Greece, where the poets and playwrights are the moral educators of the civilization, where oratory is seen as a dynamis, a power, and in fact the most important power of civic life. And when Socrates attempts to critique and challenge this culture, remember, he doesn't question the power of poetry to move people or to motivate them, to reshape their reality, reshape their values and beliefs. In fact, his entire criticism of poetry is that it does have this power. It's akin to a divine madness. It's almost like a kind of possession. It's incredibly powerful, and therefore it has to be regulated and controlled. And he compares the poets to Corybantian revelers or to the Pythian oracle. So there's this link, as Nietzsche agrees, that the aesthetic expression is linked to moral instruction and it has a religious significance. For Goethe, the main point is that poetry represents a kind of sovereignty over one's perceptions. And what I mean by this is that he understands poetry as the projection outward of what is within the poet onto the world. Quote, "Man projects his tender familiarity with himself, his desires and fears, satisfactions and discontents onto the things which surround him. It is a time of popular myth and poetical fancy. The soul overconfidently and lightheartedly frees itself from the cumbersome abstruseness of the primeval stage." End quote. And so again, to draw the comparison to ancient Greece, this is like the sophist attitude that one's words, one's speech are not part of a dialectic for revealing some truth outside of himself, but for imposing his truth, persuading others to his truth, determining opinions about things. We might say determining the perceptions or judgments about things, which allows him to determine how the world is seen. So there's a freedom here, there's an arbitrariness and a self-legislating element, all of which Nietzsche would have recognized in the Greeks. But next comes the age of theology, in which man begins to recognize that nature is not just what we make it out to be with our words, or rather that nature and the forces of nature, the gods, if you will, are beyond the power of man to control, beyond the power to control with words anyway, right? And so this is the age in which the gods reveal themselves, so to speak. So we could call these like stages of intellectual development, because we could see this as the coming into awareness of the intellect of its own limitations. The sense of its totally unrestrained freedom is disrupted. And while speech, the word, still conveys a religious and moral instruction, here's where we begin to perceive that, in fact, there's a truth outside of oneself that you have to submit to in some sense. And obviously, this age doesn't neatly begin at once. We might say the many religious figures and reformers of the Greek world, the Platonists and Neoplatonists, as well as the Stoics, they all sort of bear the coming of this age with them. But it comes fully into being with Christianity and the Christianization of the West. And in this period, the main language for talking about the world becomes theology. Quote, "It is to this epoch that ultimately God is revealed, with the fear and terror of the primeval phase purified into love and awe." End quote. But this opens up a new possibility that will soon reveal itself almost as an inevitability, because we've transitioned from the sovereign mind determining how the world is to be seen to the understanding that there is a truth in the world that is not determined by our sovereign mind. Or, as the theologian would say, it's determined by the sovereign mind of God. But this introduces that will to truth in seeing the truth outside of oneself. We might say that the awakening of the theological age is the awakening of reason, in a sense, because it's more reasonable to believe that the world transcends you than that you in your own mind could somehow encompass and influence the world with the intellect. I mean, this might be the move from magic and superstition to organized religion as the theological age, but that development sets mankind from the very beginning on this path of following reason, of determining the coherence of his beliefs. And thus, the Holy Age can't last because, quote, "Reason will insist on reasoning and ultimately, as a conqueror often does with the object of his conquests, destroy what it is reasoning about. Analyzing what eludes analysis, systematizing what defies the system, it will, in the end, deceive itself by pretending that the vainly besieged mystery does not exist. At this point, the age of the holy gives way to the age of philosophy, or to use a more familiar term, to enlightenment and finally rationalism. We cannot, says Goethe, but acknowledge the noble and intelligent endeavor of this epoch, yet while it may suit some talented individuals, it cannot satisfy whole peoples. The prosaic age is bound to follow. The all-too radical attempt of the age of philosophy at a humanization and rationalization of the mysterious ends in a perverted miracle. The mystery, cheated of its rightful place, goes underground, reverting to its primeval, unholy, and barbarous stage." End quote. And that's the condition of so-called beliefs now, isn't it? People believe in those propositions that they can't prove. And the modern rationalist worldview would therefore suggest it's probably better to have no beliefs at all, except insofar as you have knowledge, justified true beliefs, which we don't call them by that name. We just say these are the facts. This is what's proven. That's what the experts in the field all agree upon, because reason has that all-conquering power. And in the end, it drives the myth, the symbol, the belief, into the darkness of that primeval state of the human mind and says that's where it belongs, in the past. And we can recognize some similarities to other thinkers here. I mean, of course, Nietzsche, his account of the development of European nihilism, Heller points out that similarity, and his portrait of the last man, the one who says, what is longing? What is a star? What is a goal? Those are all so-called beliefs. They're not part of this utilitarian rationalist machine. And that's, all that we last men care about. Not truth, not beauty, but simply what is useful, what the bare-bone facts are, not any meaning or interpretation of them. Nietzsche calls that a form of nihilism. Another connection is to Horkheimer and Adorno with the claim that enlightenment undoes itself, that knowledge, this interrogative faculty, even robs us in the end of truth. It can't make any meaningful statements about the whole, about the unity, only about disconnected facts. And in the end, even thought becomes an object for corrosive rationality to dominate, when it was supposed to be the thing to liberate thought, right? And so it makes possible this return to barbarism, the darkest tendencies of the human mind, by banishing those myths from the intellectual sphere, such that when they return, they're totally unfettered by all the progress of modern thought. And again, one of the undercurrents of this book that I think really needs to be understood is the ways in which this has impoverished poetry by unmooring it from knowledge. We've talked a lot about how knowledge goes astray by being unmoored from, if not poetry, again, the symbol. It's a sort of a nebulous thing that we're kind of talking about that's missing, but I think we all understand by now. Hopefully, basically 3 hours into this thing, hopefully you get it. But again, poetry is just as impoverished by this whole outcome. Heller writes, quote, "No longer are there teachers who teach with calm and reason, but merely men sowing grain and weeds in random profusion. No center holds the human world together, and men must lose their bearings, for countless individuals step forth as leaders, preaching their perfect foolishness as the acme of wisdom. In such an age, every belief turns into blasphemy, and the proclamation of mysteries into sacrilege. Elements, once evolving naturally from one another, are now interlocked in perpetual strife." End quote. And these elements locked in perpetual strife are the competing spheres, as we were just discussing them, constantly threatening to rend one another asunder when they ought to be evolving naturally from one another. And so what are we to do about this in the prosaic age? What did Goethe advocate for? Might be a good question. Well, as Heller points out, quote, "There is no creed to be elicited from Goethe's writings," end quote. He found his own belief in pantheism, and oftentimes his later admirers, Nietzsche among them, find inspiration not in any of the particular ideas of Goethe, but in his character. Goethe never felt, after all, that he could put his beliefs into words. Certainly not into words that the average person would understand, the rationally minded person. And therefore, he felt it best to keep his thoughts to himself or to express them poetically. That was his solution to the problem. He did possess a belief in nature as deity, and he did possess a reverence, therefore, for the world and a gratitude for his place within it. And you could even say he tried to repay that gift of life by using every minute available to him to create great works, to give something to posterity. But really, as Heller points out, what is needed here is precisely what Nietzsche would later take up as his project. And that is, again, the revaluation of values. Quote, "What the mature Goethe means by belief is the active realization of certain values in the lives of men. And our question turns on the nature of these values, a question which, as Nietzsche knew, quote, is more fundamental than the question of the certainty of knowledge. The latter becomes serious only if the question of values is answered," end quote. And returning to Heller, quote, "Goethe would have accepted this, although it stands as a key phrase within a body of thought which at first sight is worlds apart from the world of Goethe. And Goethe actually did accept it, if not in the radical spirit in which Nietzsche proposed it, nor, of course, with the same intensity of desperate doubt about the worth of knowledge. His opposition to Newton, for instance, is ultimately based not on a conviction of his own scientific superiority, but on his commitment to values, which he believed were threatened by man's adopting an exclusively mathematical, analytical method in his dealings with nature." End quote. And so there's another parallel here, because just as with Burckhardt, Goethe perceives that same situation as Nietzsche, the situation of spiritless modernity, at least to some extent. But he takes on this problem with that temperamentally classical attitude, the attitude of the cool-headed aristocrat. And to the extent that he struggles against this problem, it's by attempting to redirect the course of science so that perhaps it can be a science that takes account for this other sphere of human life, the sphere of meaning, the ideal. Burckhardt attempts to do this in history, rather than engaging in a purely scientific and rigorous study of history. But Nietzsche's important difference is that he would say these fail to cut to the root of the problem, the values. And that's something that Goethe himself would agree with. The issue is that your struggle to make science into this more integrated, meaningful version of science can't succeed because of that logic of corrosive rationality. That version of science simply won't be allowed. All your ideas about the phenomenon are going to naturally be excluded from science. They're non-mathematical. They're not derived from empirical research. It's really the same with history. And so as long as those values of corrosive rationality govern science or history, or frankly, govern everything, so long as we believe we have to keep these spheres of human intellectual life separated, divorced, because the highest value is this pursuit of truth, the desire for truth at any cost, as Nietzsche would have put it. That means keeping truth uncontaminated by irrationality and motivation and desire for meaning. All these really hazy and vague ideas that can't be lab tested. So it has to be excluded. So as long as that is the value, you can't create a Goethean science. You can't create a Burckhartian history. These approaches are dead on arrival. Now, are they dead on arrival for Goethe or for Burckhardt? Not necessarily, and I think that's what Nietzsche respects about these men, even as it frustrates him in the case of Burckhardt. They create their own solution for themselves and their own way of squaring the circle that, from the outside in, might not even fully make sense to us and just seems like a sitting with a contradiction, and their path is never intended to work for everyone else. And Heller quotes from Twilight of Idols, and Nietzsche's words there on Goethe, which are quite beautiful, and so even though I've read this passage before, we'll read it again here. Heller quotes with some abridgments, but I'm going to quote it in full. Quote, "Goethe, no mere German, but a European event, a magnificent attempt to overcome the 18th century by means of a return to nature, by means of an ascent to the naturalness of the Renaissance, a kind of self-overcoming on the part of the century in question. He bore the strongest instincts of this century in his breast, its sentimentality and idolatry of nature, its anti-historic, idealistic, unreal, and revolutionary spirit. The latter is only a form of the unreal. He enlisted history, natural science, antiquity, as well as Spinoza, and above all, practical activity in his service. He drew a host of very definite horizons around him. Far from liberating himself from life, he plunged right into it. He did not give in. He took as much as he could on his own shoulders and into his heart. That to which he aspired was totality. He was opposed to the sundering of reason, sensuality, feeling, and will, as preached with most repulsive scholasticism by Kant, the antipodes of Goethe. He disciplined himself into a harmonious whole. He created himself. Goethe, in the midst of an age of unreal sentiment, was a convinced realist. He said yea to everything that was like him in this regard. There was no greater event in his life than that Ins Realissimum, named Napoleon. Goethe conceived a strong, highly cultured man, skillful in all bodily accomplishments, able to keep himself in check, having a feeling of reverence for himself, and so constituted as to be able to risk the full enjoyment of naturalness in all its rich profusion, and be strong enough for this freedom. A man of tolerance, not out of weakness, but out of strength, because he knows how to turn to his own profit that which would ruin the mediocre nature. A man unto whom nothing is any longer forbidden, unless it be weakness, either as a vice or as a virtue. Such a spirit becomes free, appears in the middle of the universe with a feeling of cheerful and confident fatalism, he believes that only individual things are bad and that as a whole the universe justifies and affirms itself. He no longer denies. But such a faith is the highest of all faiths. I christened it with the name of Dionysus." End quote. Now, we've broken down and analyzed this passage before, so I won't go into every last detail about it, but what we see here is that Nietzsche perceives the attempt of Goethe to unify these spheres, which have been banished from one another, not in a philosophical theory, but within himself. And thus he represents the self-overcoming of his century. The 18th century is the century of Romanticism, of all this nature idolatry and sentimentality, totally lacking in realism. And Goethe somehow contains all of these tendencies that define the Romantic age while disciplining himself, creating himself as a supreme realist. This is how he seeks the totality, the unity that's so central to his philosophy. It's how he realizes that in his own life. And there's something so affirmative and creative in this way of living that it opens up the way to the Dionysian. The whole universe justifies itself and affirms itself in him. High praise from Nietzsche. And yet Heller cautions us that we should understand Goethe's so-called realism that Nietzsche invokes here in a very particular way, as concerns the debate between realists and nominalists, for example. So this use of the term realism, it doesn't mean down to earth or anything like that. It means you affirm the reality of a given concept. And that's Heller's reading of what Nietzsche is invoking. So in the domain of morals, I brought this up last week, but I'll explain it again. So you're a moral realist if you believe morals are real, that there are moral facts. And there are many people, for example, moral relativists, who would say that view, moral realism, is actually pretty far from down to earth, right? In order to argue for this position, you normally need you need some sort of sophisticated logical argument or like a religious conviction, because a moral fact is precisely the thing we don't see when we directly perceive the world. It's something we have to come to understand through reason or analysis, right? Or through belief, on the other hand. Nominalism, though, is the position that abstract concepts don't actually exist. They don't actually have any reality. Like maybe they exist as thoughts or as concepts. You could say that thought is real insofar as being epiphenomena, but that's not the level of reality that most people are talking about when they call a concept real. When somebody says justice is real, justice can be achieved, we could live in a state of justice or injustice, and that's a real and meaningful concept, right? They don't mean that justice is a subjective state in someone's head or just a thought, right? So the nominalist position is that concepts, universals, these generalizations about reality, these categories and so on, are not real. And the realist position is that they are real in whatever sense. And that's a very old debate in metaphysics. It goes all the way back to medieval philosophy. Obviously, it has earlier forms in Greek philosophy. So which camp does Goethe fall into? Well, his notion of the Urphenomen is an idea that he thinks is at the same time real and perceptible. But it's importantly not an abstract concept. It's not arrived at by analysis. It's an idea that appears in sensation and with the aid of intuition. It can't be considered the same way as a purely abstract concept. So what does Nietzsche mean by calling Goethe a realist? Well, Heller makes the case here that what Nietzsche is invoking is realism not only opposed to nominalism, but also to idealism, particularly to transcendental idealism, all such transcendental metaphysics. It's really realism versus the transcendental. This is the metaphysical frenzy that began with Kant, when Nietzsche says everyone at Tübingen began hunting down new faculties, new ways of conceptualizing, how we reason about the absolute, which is kind of funny. It's like new ways of conceptualizing how we reason about the world that transcends human perception, by definition. Goethe writes, quote, "It is now about 20 years since the whole race of Germans began to quote, unquote, transcend. Should they ever wake up to this fact, they will look very odd to themselves," end quote. And because of this, Goethe opposes both positivism, which we could say is like the practical result of nominalist metaphysics, and the transcendental idealists. Both ultimately rely on concepts in his view. Quote, "He dreaded the emancipation of reason, whether exercised in adventures of transcendental speculation or in the mathematical calculus which creates, despite its apparent empiricism, the phenomena to be fitted into an abstract order." End quote. So Goethe's realism is part of that desire to make himself whole by not splitting off his reason from his perception and sensation and intuition. And this is the motivation between his entire pursuit of truth, whether in science or poetry. Quote, "In a true symbol, the particular represents the universal, not as a dream or shadow, but as the living and instantaneous revelation of the unfathomable." End quote. This is the value of the symbol. We have to traffic with the unfathomable, and the symbol is our confrontation with it. Heller writes, quote, "This, then, is Goethe's belief, or his answer to the problem which is, quote, more fundamental than the question of the certainty of knowledge," unquote, the problem of values. The answer lies in Goethe's realism, as understood by Nietzsche. It is the realism of the symbol, not of the obscure symbol thrown up by the collective unconscious of the symbolists, invading the husks of dead memories with dreamt and undreamt of significances, nor of the symbol which refers to abstractions in the manner of an allegory, the kind of symbol which the young philologist Nietzsche, in a preparatory note for the birth of tragedy, regarded as a sign of a dying art because it introduced, furtively and in flimsy disguise, abstract notions. But the symbol in its original meaning, defined by Nietzsche in the same note in a strikingly Goethe-like manner as, quote, "the language of the universal," end quote. It describes, and in describing, it opens our eyes to what really is. And what really is not a dream or shadow, nor the meaningless agony of the will, nor the abstractions of reason, but the living revelation of the unfathomable. Yet why should the unfathomable be beautiful? Because it can only be comprehended by the unfathomable, and the only truly unfathomable faculty of man is love. Thus, the realism of the symbol becomes the artistic vindication of the reality of a lovable world. Quote, "that something like Spinoza's Amor Dei could be experienced again." This is a note which Nietzsche, during his most radical Antichrist period, made about Goethe. End quote. And I think that's a wonderful passage. Seeing Goethe's project through the eyes of recapturing Spinoza's Amor Dei, and that's what Nietzsche calls the Dionysian. And Nietzsche tries to do this. Goethe tried to do this through art and poetry, but Nietzsche does it through philosophy. And obviously, in Nietzsche's early career, he thought life could be justified aesthetically, which, if you think about it, doesn't necessarily have to involve philosophy. In fact, during the period in which Nietzsche says the Greeks justified their existence with aesthetics, they were a rather unreflective people during that time. But for whatever reason, Nietzsche cannot be satisfied. He cannot rest here at aesthetics. He continues to seek the unity in his philosophy. And remember, a significant aspect of Nietzsche's project is that this revaluation of values has to occur consciously. He criticizes the value of truth, but he continually recapitulates to it. He demands, in fact, we follow the will to truth through to its ultimate conclusions. And that means recognizing the necessity of the revaluation, and therefore the necessity of even redefining the truth. And so that's how Nietzsche makes his attempt to classify the former view of truth into a kind of error that was indispensable for life, and put forward a new definition of truth in which health is an aspect of truth, or in which truth must make valuing possible, which means making judgment possible, which means being arbitrary, being unjust, because Nietzsche says that's what judging means. And therefore, truth which undermines valuing is no truth at all. And so the dream of Goethe of the reclamation of the symbol set against these ideologies that rend the mind from the heart was, as Heller puts it, driven to despair. In the half-century between the life of Goethe and Nietzsche, Goethe's prophecy of the coming prosaic age was proven to be relatively prescient. But Goethe worried in a letter to von Humboldt that he wrote just before he died that his greatest work, Faust, would fall on deaf ears, that he was leaving his great poem to an age that no longer had a feeling for poetry. Heller writes, quote, "Nietzsche, in order to transform this despair into affirmation, had to call in so un-Goethean a spirit as that of Dionysus. The comparison between the god of Goethe's Amor Dei and Nietzsche's love of Dionysus yields the measure by which we can assess the distance the prosaic age has traveled from Goethe's time to Nietzsche's, or the depth to which it has sunk. For with all the radical and indeed obvious differences between Goethe and Nietzsche, differences of character, genius, temperament, modes of thought and expression, they nevertheless meet in their concern for and in their vision of the proper state of man. Nietzsche is the outraged believer of Goethe's beliefs, the scandalized and scandalizing upholder of Goethe's values, fighting out within his own soul the battle between belief and unbelief, accepting for himself the fates of the tortured martyrs of either side and the role of the adjudicator of victories and defeats." End quote. And I think that's a really powerful summation of the influence of Goethe on Nietzsche. That one could argue that Nietzsche takes up for the spirit of Goethe's realism of the symbol, if not holding to the letter of what Goethe asserted. And Nietzsche identifies within Goethe this fundamental concern over values, the value of knowledge, of science, of truth, and of course the potential values that we're stamping out or suppressing by holding this rationalist view of truth above all else. And Nietzsche takes that struggle very seriously, again almost with the fervor of a religious zealot. That as much as Nietzsche ridiculed the idea of a metaphysical need, he spends a great deal of time arguing for his inverted anti-Platonism, anti-metaphysics, which could be argued to be a form of metaphysics. And for all his criticism of religion, his work culminates in this mythic prophet who heralds his revaluation. Quote, "Toward the end of his conscious life, Nietzsche was convinced that the culture of Europe was doomed, that an eclipse of all traditional values was at hand. He quoted Pascal, who said that without the Christian belief, we shall become to ourselves what nature and history will become to us, a monster and a chaos. The sections of Will to Power which are concerned with the coming of European nihilism read like a vast elaboration on that dictum of Pascal's as well as Goethe's prophecy of the prosaic age. Nietzsche believed that its approach was inevitable, but the paradox, which is the very life of true prophecy, also sustained, until madness possessed him, the prophet Nietzsche. That prophetic paradox within which historical inevitability is defeated through an act of spiritual conquest. God has decided to destroy the temple. In the name of God, rescue the temple from the wrath of God. This is the paradox of every true prophet." End quote. And so Heller outlines a certain reading of Nietzsche, which I have explained in the past on this podcast, which is also given by Deleuze, which is poetically put forward by Stefan Zweig, that nihilism has a very important function in Nietzsche's work. His form of nihilism, his active nihilism, is not just a passive acceptance of the desacralization of the world and just sort of letting oneself be rolled over by the totalizing power of will to truth, but harnessing that development in order to turn it into a weapon to be used for the sake of life, rather than truth in the abstract. But to get to that place, you have to complete the critique, right? German idealists are always trying to complete the system, whereas for Nietzsche, I think it's about completely destroying the system by critiquing it to death. And maybe Hegelian wouldn't even necessarily disagree with that since, the power of the concept is negation, but that's neither here nor there. Active nihilism is very important for Nietzsche. And arguably, I'm not even sure if you can really comprehend his affirmative philosophy unless you totally enter into that negative, negating attitude, fully embrace the active nihilism. And so Heller writes, quote, "He was determined to go to the very end of the positivist disillusionment, shed skin after skin of comforting beliefs, destroy every fortress manned by protective gods. In fact, to banish the last vestiges of magic which still save man from the final exposure to his tragedy, and then to bring to life once more Goethe's vision of the glorious integrity of things. Until this was done, even the nearest German approximation to Dionysian acceptance, even Goethe, would fail us. For he had an inclination to play truant when life was teaching its most desperate lessons. And indeed it was about to teach them to Europe. At the approach of the terror of ultimate knowledge, Goethe withdrew into the healing darkness of the unconscious, trusting to intuition that it would restore the brightness of day in the created work of art. But Nietzsche dreamt, and dreamt in vain, of an artist of the future who would reach in his art that turning point where the highest degree of consciousness and self-consciousness transforms itself into a new spontaneity, primitivity, and innocence, just as he strove to realize the utmost of nihilistic despair to arrive at a new faith and mobilized all forces of negation to defeat all denial." End quote. And I have very little comment on that. It's almost too perfect. It's a beautiful summation. I think it helps tie together the role for Nietzsche as Heller sees it in this dialectic of the symbol, as we might christen it. And yet Heller does something that I think is a little too common in retellings of Nietzsche's life, the interaction of his life and philosophy whenever that's discussed, and that he kind of saddles Nietzsche's philosophy with the responsibility for driving him mad. It's an old chestnut about Nietzsche. His philosophy drove him mad. The paradoxical nature of his thought somehow rent his mind asunder. That, as Heller puts it, the severed spheres consume one another within him. And that, his experiment with truth ends in catastrophe for himself more than anyone else. I personally don't put much stock into these kind of remarks because I think it's frankly unrealistic to think that someone's philosophy could drive them mad. I think it ignores the physiological basis of Nietzsche's mental collapse. And I think it's a convenient and, dare I say, poetic or symbolic ending to seize upon as like the climax of the Nietzsche tale. Nietzsche made this experiment with truth and it destroyed him. It's a way of ending his story, as I said, in a climactic way. And perhaps from the attitude of a symbolic thinker, that's sufficient because we're simply using Nietzsche to reveal an image of life or something like that. But perhaps I'm too much of a Nietzschean disciple of truth myself, too critical in my thinking to really accept that. We can't, as Heller himself argues, leap straight into the Goethean glorious integrity of things without first taking positivism, rationalism, the whole modern worldview. We have to take it through to its end. You have to first critique it and ultimately negate it. You have to get over it, right? You have to destroy before you can create. And I think that's one of the most misunderstood and subtle insights in Nietzsche's canon. But again, we have to talk about the other side here, because so much of the book is about the hazard of unrestrained rationalism, but also the hazard of modern poetry. And Heller emphasizes this at the end of the book. In the last years of his life, Goethe wrote that young poets should be cautioned to remember, as Heller paraphrases him, that, quote, "Poetry may well accompany life, but does not know how to guide it. However ambitious the artist may be," he added, "in the end he will find that he has expressed merely his own individuality. For, quote, what is in a poem is essentially the same as that which is in one's own life," end quote. Poetry is hazardous precisely for the reason that the unrestrained intellect is hazardous. It's simply the inverse. And again, we're really addressing romanticism here, but as something of a tendency rather than an explicit ideology. Heller says, quote, "Who, I wonder, could have said before a romantic poet, Novalis, said it, that there ought to be poems of mere beautiful sounds and beautiful words, disconnected and without sense," end quote. Further in the passage, he continues, quote, "Value was contraband of unreality, smuggled into the real world by cunning poets. Poetic creativeness became the illicit traffic in smuggled goods. The inflation of the real was both cause and effect of desperate investments in unreal property. Real contents were worthless. Pure form was what mattered. The meaning of words meant nothing. Their sound was the thing. Everything that was not created by the artist himself was felt to be dead and deadening matter. Its mere touch threatened to paralyze the hand of the creator," end quote. And can we not detect some of that same sentiment even in Nietzsche, who is anti-romantic on an ideological level, but following Schopenhauer and Wagner, he wished for the aesthetic redemption to come from music and purely from music, and in his Birth of Tragedy, he railed against the overimportance given to the words in modern opera. Mallarmé expressed a similar yearning when he wished that he could find words that somehow transcended their common meaning, somehow became pure symbols. He ultimately envied the power of music, by the way, over and above poetry, because music can convey such a thing, and words oftentimes feel like they can't. And so the prosaic age is not the victory of rationality over sentimentality. They're both freed from their checks on one another, and they both go wild. Senseless sentimentality is just as much of a feature of the prosaic age as the opposite excesses. In the arts and poetry, we've seen the rise of what Novalis called true anarchy. We can see that tendency in Dada, or in abstract and postmodern art and surrealism. It comes through not just in practice, but in theory, in modern ideologies surrounding art. There's the literary critic Roland Barthes, who gave us that interpretive theory of the death of the author, sundering any concrete meaning from the text, opening it up to endless debate that can never reach a productive end. And so pure rationality ultimately deprives us of truth, paradoxically speaking. And the rise of this symbolic anarchy, unrestrained symbolic realism in the Goethean sense, deprives us of meaning. Quote, "The symbolist and surrealist impulse soon spent itself. Baudelaire already knew that this frenzied passion of art was a canker. No lasting universe of beauty was built from the fragments of creation. In the end, they remained fragments, shored against the poet's ruins. He was back in the wasteland. A 17th century vision seemed to come true once more. No arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." End quote. And Heller then quotes from T.S. Eliot, whom he says diagnoses the situation of modern poetry in his poems. Quote, "Because one has only learnt to get the better of words, for the thing one no longer has to say, or the way in which one is no longer disposed to say it. And so each venture is a new beginning, a raid on the inarticulate with shabby equipment always deteriorating in the general mess of imprecision of feeling, undisciplined squads of emotion." End quote. And that last line, I think, is a perfect summation of what this total anarchy of the spirit really looks like. And it's exactly what happens when one does not discipline themselves to wholeness, as Goethe did. When one does not attempt to harness romanticism and overcome it, but simply lets it run roughshod over them, we return to that dark barbarism, the inarticulate primordial age of man. Merely, we think we're throwing ourselves into sentimentality, into the symbolic, into meaning, but we end up just expressing our base impulses, which come one after the other with no reason, no vision, no meaning to govern it all. And so the final point, really, that Heller makes is that just as the search for truth as the highest and only value has led the intellectual life of man into ruin, its counterpart is beauty as the sole value. And this will also lead our intellectual life into ruin. It's the paralogism of the Romantics. And this calls to mind for me one of Adorno and Horkheimer's notes, in which they said, one of the possibilities open to us in confronting the self-undermining nature of enlightenment, the way in which rationality claims to liberate but only continues to enslave us, one possible way to confront that is to scorn reason in all those instances in which reason proves itself to be against humanity. Well, consider all that in light of these lines from Rilke, very famous lines. Quote, "But beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror we're still able to bear. And why we adore it so is because it serenely disdains to destroy us." End quote. Heller's comment here is that Rilke's Duino elegies, quote, "do set out to search for man, not for the life-devouring beauty. Beauty is no longer the ultimate and absolute end. On the contrary, the terror which begins with beauty is in the wholeness and integrity of being, and it terrifies us because we have betrayed it. In betraying it, we have corrupted not only ourselves, but all things around us. They fall apart in a way, and their place is taken by deeds without words or images. It is the end of meaning and sense, and thus the end of poetry. That poetry can only be recovered with the recovery of meaning and sense is paradoxically the starting point of the poetry of Rilke's final phase. Its conclusion is in the paradox of its beginning. The poet, confirmed by his own achievement and his power of song and praise, offers himself, his song and praise, as evidence for meaning and sense. Yet, as he was a poet at the outset, this proof proves nothing, and Rilke's search for man's reality ends, once again, with the discovery of a reality that is the poet's own imagination. End quote. Nietzsche once said that science has begun to divine the limits of the theoretical way of life, but ultimately cannot do anything against the corrosive power of reason without undermining itself. Poets have also begun to divine the limits of the life lived purely in pursuit of beauty. Certainly Heller sees it here. We also discussed this in the analysis of The Secret History by Donna Tartt earlier this season, and her main character, who describes himself as someone with a morbid longing for the picturesque at all costs. He wants nothing more than a beautiful life, for a life that satisfies him aesthetically. And to create that life, and to protect it, he is led down a path in which he becomes a worse person. He's led down, we might say, a senseless path, but also an amoral one. He becomes an accomplice to murder, and the cover-up of that murder. He becomes a liar. He sees himself and his circle of friends destroyed in various ways. And he ends by being frustrated and unfulfilled. The story's a tragedy in that way, and it's a beautiful story. And in a sense, it could serve as a warning against, the danger that comes with living purely for beauty. And Tartt quotes from Rilke, or one of her characters does, from those lines over the course of the story. We began this season with an exploration of the Oedipus plays of Sophocles, and the underlying meaning of that play. Sophocles shows us the tragic end of the one who pursues the fatal truth, the deadly truth, against all warnings. This has been a repeated theme throughout the season. It wasn't necessarily intentional, but it's kind of worked out that way. So what about the opposite, the total abandonment of truth? What about the deadliness of the pursuit of beauty? Nietzsche admired that trait insofar as he saw it in the Greeks. They were a people who lived in appearance and loved life as appearance. Burckhardt saw the same thing about the Greeks, and yet he said, yes, the Greeks and their Olympians, they were beautiful, but they were not good, and thus they had to perish. And are we not in the same situation? Are we now to perish because of our excessive reason? That was Goethe's prophecy, and Nietzsche's. And the only way to defy this fate would seem to be in the manner of the prophet, as Heller describes, who in the name of God tries to save the temple from the wrath of God. In other words, there is a paradoxical and thus irrational faith at the heart of all attempts to seek this unity again, rescue the symbolic from the underworld, or however we want to put it. And to add my own concluding note, again, this is not something that we quote-unquote solve. This tension between the symbol and the real strikes at the very heart of our crisis of values, the whole crisis of the modern world. And Goethe would say that it is the same struggle between belief and unbelief that constitutes the only enduring story about the condition of man. Erich Heller says in one of the concluding passages that is the poet's task, to determine and give expression to the condition of man. And every great poet sets himself anew against this Gordian knot. He has to cut through it in his own way, whether his name be Dante, Virgil, Hölderlin, Rilke, or Friedrich Nietzsche. That concludes Season 5 of the Nietzsche Podcast. Thank you all so much for joining me for the now 120 regular episodes of the show. I'm so grateful for you all, so grateful to be able to share so much of myself and what I love with all of you. I couldn't do that if you weren't here willing to listen. And thank you especially to all the patrons of the show. You have made it possible for this show to become so much more than I ever thought it could become. When I first had that crazy idea back in 2021, maybe I should start a podcast. It's been a wild journey, And it's been just an amazing privilege for me, and I hope it's been fulfilling and enriching for all of you. And with that, we're going to return next time for Book 4 of The Gay Science. I'll have updates about what to expect in Season 6 in due time. So until that time, that's it, everybody. Cheers. Amor fati. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.